Welcome to the Band of Gamers podcast. This is episode 96. It's late, so I almost said the inverse. But no, it is episode 96. We are inching our way to episode 100 as we continue our way through E3. So today was the Nintendo Spotlight, and last night was the Sony press conference. And Sony's press conference was a little bit different. I thought, at least. Zeus, did you have a chance to watch it? It started with the pre-show, and then they had a relatively short, at least for Sony, time on stage in what they considered their main press conference.
Yeah, so I did watch it. I regret that in my hustle and bustle today, I forgot that Nintendo was up today as well, since they weren't actually at E3. So I'm fully prepared to talk Sony, but I may not be able to offer that much in terms of Nintendo.
Well, it was only a 25-minute video production from Nintendo, so it left many people in various chats surprised. We knew it was only going to be about a half hour, but it even was less than that. And then they went on to introduce a number of other games during their kind of on the show floor. So we'll get to that, but first, let's go back to last night with the Sony press conference. And Zeus, I am joined here again by Zeus Adamus. Osiris Prime is out this week, missing it and living vicariously through you all and the rest of us in terms of where we are at with E3. So I will say, Zeus, that I came late to the party for the Sony press conference. I was prepared for the 9 o'clock Eastern hour, and it seems like I missed some things with the pre-show. So I will go ahead and talk through a little bit of those pre-show pieces, and feel free to jump in if there are things you want to talk about, and then we'll spend some more time on what was covered in the actual 55-minute press conference.
So let me ask you, what are you defining as the pre-show? Is this the period of time in which something was mentioned about Gran Turismo Sport that nobody saw because it was in the pre-show?
Yes, that is exact. Or half of the games that I was looking forward to see. That I was sitting and I watched the press conference with former old Kagger World Voyager on Xbox. Right, we're watching a Sony press conference on Twitch on the Xbox. But so yes, so we got on. We're watching the show, and both of us were wondering throughout the time, where was this game? Where was that game? But it turns out there was a pre-show, and it was covered by various outlets, right? That it was part of the awareness. Somehow I missed that idea of what they were trying to cover in the pre-show through the press coverage. I was looking at what they had announced as the prime time press conference. And, there's been pre-shows in the past, but usually they've been not this kind of reveal that we've had here. So again, in the pre-show, we had the Lost Legacy, so the Uncharted game that's coming out in August. We had Ni no Kuni 2. We had that Japanese JRPG by Studio Ghibli, although they're not directly involved, but it's level 5. Knack 2, again, a game. We had a lot of games coming out this fall. Knack 2, Crash Remastered, VR Super Hot, which I think, or Super Hot VR, which is a nice get for PlayStation VR. We had some Horizon Zero Dawn DLC. We also had the indie game Undertale, which is, I think, the only time that the images or text of Vita were displayed by Sony during both the pre-show and the press conference. And then we had a pretty sizable piece on GT Sport. So that kind of walked through the developer. We got to see his station. We got to, it was kind of Nintendo-like in terms of how much time they spent getting into the mind of the developer and where things are at. But the big piece that surprised me about GT Sport is that it's actually has a release date, and it's coming this fall. So, Zeus, did you get a chance to go back and to look at some of the pre-show pieces like GT?
So I didn't, and I'm not, right. So I'm kind of I'm going to admittedly say I'm coming into tonight a little hot, right, because of various issues around this press conference, and a lot of these things to me, games to me, in a lot of ways, I have the same sort of expectations that I have of other forms of media. And one of my big things about other forms of media is you can't require me to go view your other content outside of your primary conveyance piece, and put the burden on me to consume that data. So my feeling is whatever Sony wanted to communicate to me as a gamer needed to be in their primary press conference, not in some shadow presentation that only like spec operatives knew about, right? So I stand by what I said, coming into the E3, which is I'm a gamer. You can argue whether I'm a big gamer or not, but I'm definitely a driving sim gamer. I'm hotly interested in these games. There's a lot of racing games coming out this fall from different publishers, different devs on different consoles, and I still, because of this now, I still am not certain that I am sure that I understand what Gran Turismo Sport is. So unless I happen to stumble across it while I'm reading stuff on the web, and I do that periodically, right? But it's far more likely that I'm going to stumble across some soundbite in some nib, and I'm not going to stumble across a summary of what Gran Turismo Sport and its design intent is. So there's a good chance I'm not going to buy it again. So it's a shame, I think. And what's so weird to me is, the things that you went down were shown again in the primary press conference, right? Our trailer for Horizon Zero Dawn DLC was shown again. Uncharted Lost Legacy kicked off the primary press conference. So what I don't understand is...
So I think I had that one wrong. So Uncharted
Okay.
Lost Legacy, I think for me it bled into where it stopped within the pre-show.
Gotcha.
And where the full show started. So yes,
Okay.
So Lost Legacy kind of kicks us off. So
Gotcha.
we'll put that to the side.
Right.
We haven't gone back and watched the GT spot,
Mhm.
GT Sport spot. I don't know that I necessarily understand any more about it than it's a GT game, right? I mean, we spent a lot of time with the developer. It looks beautiful, but we didn't get kind of that classic GT. Here's the modeling. Here's the physics. It wasn't like, and so I will say that from what I saw from even the main press conference, that there were a lot of packaged trailers, but not a lot of gameplay demos, right? There were very few times where it looked like this was the in-game engine running, right? So we had Lost Legacy that did that. We had Days Gone, which kind of, those two big games kind of led off. But then there were a lot of things that blended a lot of kind of in-game graphics and maybe some gameplay there until we got to the very end with Spider-Man. So
yeah, so their whole structure and format of this press conference was starkly different from Microsoft's, and I'm not saying that that's inherently bad, but it was just different. One of the big things is, unless there were people sitting in the dark in the Microsoft conference, and I didn't quite catch that, it seemed like Sony's was a much larger venue. I felt like the Microsoft press conference was kind of intimate with a small number of people, where like Sony basically had like an entire opera house, and a very large opera house, with all three different areas of seating fully occupied. But one of the things they did, and I complimented Phil Spencer on the whole, I mentioned he got on the stage, he would do his little bit, and then he would get out of the way, right, and let the games kind of take center stage. But he was still involved enough that I had a sense of leadership. I don't know who Sean Layden is. I only know that he's not Kaz Hirai, right? So, and I know Kaz has moved on and been promoted, but Sean Layden doesn't communicate to me any sense of leadership, or a focal point. I'm not going to say that it's a bad thing for a business leader in the gaming industry to appear on stage in a suit, but he was on stage in a suit, and that immediately disconnected me from the conference. And then he only came out twice, and to me, I don't necessarily need a ton of talking in these E3 press conferences, but what was missing was there was no communication or conveyance of like design intent or where these games were going or why they were. So as we go through this, like I have a ton of games and I'm like, I don't understand why I should care about this game. Like, what role does this thing play in the lineup? Why is it important? And since there were I guess maybe the right way to say it is, fine if Sean Layden only comes on stage twice, but besides him, there was zero Sony presence in this press conference. There were no developers, no creative directors, no producers, and I just don't get it.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a little bit. So Sean Layton, just for clarity's sake, is the president and CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment of America. So he's kind of that businessman. And he said in other things, that he is not, he doesn't like the limelight, doesn't see himself as a star, doesn't want that kind of spectacle around him, which is, as you said, which is fine. But also by the sheer fact that you're hosting this in this giant venue, like you said, it ends up being kind of part of the reality of what it is. But he did. I mean, he came out only twice. It was, they did a lot of, here's the games, we're going to show you, not tell you things, and I think you could argue that the show not tell is always been powerful, but I think they almost went too far. So I feel like, yeah, and I don't want to. I feel like it was almost too confident, right? Like they're in a 2-1 lead. They're they're in the middle of their cycle. Here's what we got. Enjoy. It was not the other change. I think the big change for me for the last couple of years was that the last year's press conference that people raved about was a lot of forward-looking things. Here are things that are announced. These are teasers, and there were very little dates. Almost everything we got this year at the main press conference had a date to it. And so that was a nice change of pace, but it also was, it didn't have a sense of excitement. And you could even see that in the crowd. The first time that the crowd really clapped for anything was after God of War, which is halfway through the press conference.
Yeah, and I may be using a different rubric. So I don't count 2018 as a date, and so by my tally, I mean my notes, in fact, like all the way throughout this, and it's become more firm throughout the day. Is my perception is the tagline I'm using is that 50% of what was showed on that stage did not have a date. So that is things that literally had no date. There were trailers that just ended, and there was no date scroll at the end.
And that's what happened last year too.
Right.
There were a lot of games like Spider-Man that had no date to it. God of War, all the big games had no date to them at all last year.
Right. So this year, what's lumped into my perception of this is the ones that actually had no date and ones that said 2018. I didn't feel like that. I didn't count those as having a date. So to me, like I said, I'm walking around with the perception that like only 50% of their games had a date, and that to me is being lenient. Like you mentioned, the Gran Turismo, right? I don't count that as a date in June when that game is supposed to be coming out in the fall. Like they should be able to at least nail it down to a month. Again, particularly given all the competition that Gran Turismo is going to face when it does come out.
Sure, or all the times that it's been delayed for other versions of GT, right? Just because it says 2007 doesn't actually mean it's going to come out in 2007.
Yeah, so I tweeted out today, and I'll stand by this for some continuing amount of time, that the fact that a game that big was shown in the pre-show and is only squared down to the fall, I feel like that game's certainly going to be delayed.
So this is maybe something that we look at for our Thursday show, is that if we end up hearing about hands-on time with it, right? Like they didn't show a lot in the press conferences, but there's 30 minutes of stuff that people are playing on the show floor. That changes my mind. But I think for a lot of these games, I'm very curious to see what is playable for people. And so that's kind of been, since this is the first official day, I'll be interested to see what people are coming away with in terms of how much time do they actually get with something like Days Gone, with Gran Turismo, things that are coming, even what else is coming this fall from Sony, Marvel versus Capcom. I'm assuming they probably had a whole lot there, but then there's going to be bits and pieces that I don't even know are anything more than a trailer. Monster Hunter, Shadow of Colossus,
Right. So I'm going to throw this out at this point, since it looks like with your list, Sony's list is pretty short. So with the exception of Call of Duty, Skyrim, Destiny 2, all of which are third-party games, unless I am mistaken, everything that was shown at the main press conference was a third-person action title.
Looking through, yes, I think that is pretty accurate. Which is also kind of Sony's bag, that they have been more in that third-person action title venue than their first-person party exclusive games like Resistance or Killzone have never really had traction either.
Yeah, so this year I felt like it crossed the threshold to me and felt very, very, very much like an Ubisoft thing. Like I was taking notes and taking notes and taking notes. I'm like, oh, a third-person action game. Oh, a third-person action game. Oh, a third-person. I'm like, that's all they're doing now. With their first-party studios. So, and I've definitely been accustomed to, they've had, like you said, they've had more of that content than Microsoft. But this year I felt like it went overboard, and it really causes me to kind of question where they are creatively right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could run down that list of things that were shown at the main press conference, from Uncharted Lost Legacy to Days Gone. Days Gone being Sony Ben, that those guys are the Siphon Filter guys, so it's been third-person action games for them. Then we get, let's keep just going down the list of Sony games. Then we move down to God of War, which again finally has a date, 2018, early 2018. I'm going to say that probably comes out in that Horizon Zero Dawn time period in March. But again,
and I count that as having a date, because they tightened it up to at least early. So
yep. Yeah, which is not the case for some other things. We have Detroit Becoming Human, which is the David Cage, Heavy Rain and Fahrenheit, and the other types of kind of choose your adventure third-person action games, as we're talking about. And then we end up with Spider-Man, which is Insomniac, which has always been strong in third-person action games with Ratchet and Clank and Sunset Overdrive, and it looks like it plays very much like Rocksteady's Batman franchise, which also makes a whole lot of sense, because Spider-Man, as we're both comic fans, right? The Spidey sense aspect has always made more sense to me than Detective Vision for Batman. But again, a third-party action game, and so it was a very strong showing of those games. But and maybe that's why they leaned into it, though, is that if you have third parties putting out solid first-person shooter games, you've got EA and you've got Activision. What's the incentive for Sony to invest those resources when the market's already saturated in other places?
Yeah, and I can understand that. I'm not as positive about the strength of the titles that were shown. The one thing I will say is, one of the things that stood out to me in the Microsoft press conference was that when you saw games that were coming to Xbox One X, I kind of questioned the graphical fidelity that was displayed. I could definitely tell the difference between something like a Forza 7 versus other games that were not as tightly polished. I didn't feel like I saw that here. I felt like everything on PS4 Pro, I assume is what they were using to render, actually looked pretty amazing. But I had some questions. There was and I won't get into some of the showmanship of the press conference itself. There were some issues there too, but kind of overall, I felt like thematically, this press conference was very kind of macabre and gruesome and very violent. I would have been troubled had I had like a 12 to 13-year-old that I'd said, hey, watch the E3 press conference with me this year, right? And then Days Gone would have come up. I'm like, that was a brutal trailer. So that's, and I wonder if that's a thematic representation of kind of where Sony is heading.
So can I go to that, since I had my 12-year-old sitting with me through the press conference? He came in after Days Gone was just kind of wrapping up, so he saw the guy headbutt the guy at the end and a gunshot, right? But then he saw the rest of the press conference, and I guess truthfully, after what year was it when they ended with The Last of Us? And they had the shotgun to the face, and between that and when they had God of War Ascension and the violence there, it to me has felt like Sony has been moving in that direction for quite a while. I think part of the reason that it may feel a little different this year than the last 2 years is that the last 2 years was a lot of teases, a lot of concepts, but not a lot of gameplay. And so, it was violent. He's a big Overwatch player. He's playing, but at the same time, he's not super into Call of Duty. He's not playing Doom or Wolfenstein. So there's a line there. I'm still a parent, I promise. But I think we did talk about God of War a little bit when it was shown. We talked about it in terms of, oh, it just kind of looks like God of War, right? To him, it wasn't that interesting because he's seen it other places, and it didn't look that new to him. And so it was gruesome, and it didn't really excite him because it felt stale.
Right, and I guess maybe I will get into a couple things on the showmanship of the press conference. So you mentioned the God of War thing, and maybe it's not just showmanship, but kind of the games that were displayed, and why I'm not as up that they showed like this knockout punch of a game cavalcade is, and that's one of the things. Like God of War looked awesome, but like you said, but I felt like mechanically I was seeing the same systems that I played in God of War 1, and I thought about that in contrast to Horizon Zero Dawn and why I love that game so much. And I love the game so much because the system complexity in that game amps to 100, but it's conveyed so elegantly. And the big tell for me is, as you know, I stinking hate crafting. I don't hate crafting in Horizon Zero Dawn. They have taken a very complex topic and they haven't dumbed it down. They've just given it clarity and kind of demystified it. But it still works with a level of complexity that allows you to walk into games and feel like your technology and your cunning is one of your weapons. But as when I watched Gears of War, I was like, okay, more Gears of War. And I'm not saying that I'm not up for more Gears of War, but it's just more Gears of War. One of the things that Layden mentioned when he was on stage the first time is he goes, with PS4 Pro and with PSVR, we have these powerful systems that feature both full 4K and HDR. And he waited for applause. And then he actually said, let that sink in for a minute. And I'm like, dude, you're not telling us anything we don't know. Like, you've had 4K and HDR since 2016. Like, it was just, what I wrote here is I said, this feels like somebody trying to pull an Apple press conference, not like a game show. So it just kind of fell kind of flat with me. And then when he ran through the list of games of 2016 that signified the PlayStation 4's success as a platform, I'm pretty sure at least 3 of them, maybe 4, were third party. So I don't know.
But a lot of those were exclusive, right? I mean, so you had Neo, which is a Tecmo game, but exclusive to Xbox or to Sony. That had Nier Automata, which is a Platinum game. It's console exclusive, right? It goes back to that discussion we had the other day of it's also on PC, but it's exclusive there. And then you have things like Horizon, which is very much exclusive and amazing.
Right.
So, and I think, I almost wonder if that kind of strong spring made this fall lineup feel even weaker, because I left this press conference as much of a Sony fan as I've been, and I remember being on this podcast last year and defending the Sony press conference. That I left the end of this 55 minutes feeling really nonplussed. It was, maybe it's because there wasn't any really big surprise. It was because the only real surprise were Monster Hunter World, which makes a whole lot of sense for the Japanese audience in Asia, and Shadow of Colossus, which is one of my favorite games of all time, but I also own it on PlayStation 2 and also on PlayStation 3. So.
Yeah, and here's the thing: where not having a developer come up on stage really hurts them. So I know that it's I know that there are 2 opinions out there. I know that the developers are saying that it's a remake, and I think Sony corporate is calling it a remaster. But I get that that they're doing the same. It's a do-over, right? But they just played the trailer in the press conference, right? People who aren't intimately familiar with that whole development cycle that thing has gone through and the back and forth, like, they don't know whether it's a remake or a remaster or it's a brand new game. So it just, I don't know. It's just definitely I felt like there was a big communication problem in it. So the Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, I came back around to it when they closed it up. As they were doing it, I was like, why are they showing us all these cutscenes? Marvel vs. Capcom's a fighting game. Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. And then they came out with still a kind of cryptic thing that makes me think that, oh, okay, it has a single-player campaign this time. But they sure took their slow time to wind around to that. That's one that has a release date of September 19th. So that was
yes, nice. Right. And I think that, to me, felt very much like a response to the strength of Injustice 2, right? Injustice 1 and Injustice 2 have been critically acclaimed for their story modes. And, so this feels like Capcom saying, hey, wait a minute, we can do this too.
Right. So one thing that I noticed, and I wrote a note down that just realized that Microsoft had neither Battlefield nor Call of Duty. And so EA is clearly a very strong partner. But EA is still clearly a strong partner with Microsoft with Anthem, because I feel like that's where they put most of the Anthem content on display. But that little tete-a-tete is still kind of interesting that's where both of those big, huge set piece type games were put on display.
Well, and we didn't get anything from either Microsoft or Sony's stage for Battlefront 2, did we? I don't know that there was any.
EA kept that to themselves, but they did several hours of Battlefront stuff on Saturday during the press conference, and then afterwards at EA Play.
Yep. So let's talk about that with Call of Duty and Destiny. Is that we kind of knew that Activision was going to have them there because they don't have their own event, and they have some exclusive pieces with Destiny for sure, but in both cases, I walked away kind of disappointed that there wasn't more gameplay shown. That Call of Duty cut in between, rendered cutscenes and a little bit of multiplayer, and they touted it as the debut of multiplayer, right? You didn't even know that it was multiplayer. It was just, oh, okay, now this looks like it's in-engine. And in Destiny's case, granted, the story trailer that they showed, had more story than the majority of the first game, and was done really well, but they didn't actually give us any more gameplay. We had, here's what makes it exclusive for Sony, but I sure thought that on the Sony stage that there was going to be some reveal. Maybe it's, here's a new strike. Here is, let's play a PvP map together, right? I think it goes back to that theme that it was a lot of sizzle reel without any elongated demos. And maybe that'll change on the floor, and we'll be able to see that a little bit more by Thursday. But that's the surprising piece for both Call of Duty and for Destiny, is it seemed like a missed opportunity.
Yeah, so I guess I'll say one positive is so Call of Duty did identify. Well, so Call of Duty went available for pre-order, I guess, during the press conference or around or that day. It ships November 8th. Skyrim VR, I kind of felt like it was a big, not a big reveal, but like was an important statement to make. What I wrote is I don't care, but it's good for other people.
I agree, especially coming off of Bethesda's with Fallout VR being on Vive and having Skyrim VR here on PlayStation VR. I think is a nice get for them.
Right. So here's a big thing that I felt like I realized and wrote down is, so Microsoft, counter to my predictions, made zero mention of VR plans for Xbox One X. Highly surprises me, because I don't understand how, well, part of the strategy is to trumpet the convergence of Windows platforms, and we know that they're trying to make the Xbox more like, feel and look more like Windows. Sony, so now I don't have, as of right now, I have no VR thing to invest in for the 2017 for this bottom half. That means I can probably find some money in the couch cushions, right, to spend on PlayStation VR if I chose to, because there's nothing to spend that money on in Microsoft's direction. So, it kind of makes that competitive space very interesting now, right? Because a lot of people held off on VR in year one, which to me was 2016, right? So if you held off on Oculus, if you held off on Vive, and you held off on Sony, now you're into 2017, which for most tech enthusiasts would you make your purchase in the second year because you waited, and there's nothing there to represent Microsoft. So
So let me ask though, did they do anything to convince you that VR was a good sell for Sony? Is Final Fantasy Fishing
no,
gonna be a sell?
I won't
I know that's
say
a cheap one. I know.
it's. I won't say what I have written here in my notes for that game. It's several four-letter words though. But I was like Monster in the Deep, Final Fantasy 15 ? Exclamation point, and a bunch of other stuff. So no, but what did start to catch my interest was what is the game that they showed that starts with a B?
Bravo Team?
Yes. So that looked interesting, but you know what? I said that nothing in the Sony lineup looked janky from a 4K HDR perspective. That one did. It looked.
Yes, it did.
It didn't look as refined graphically as others, and it's not even a graphics problem, so I don't know that it'll go away. The character animation seemed very hokey to me when you were looking around at your teammates who were like sliding on the ground into position, and then popping back up to the kneeled position. It just looked a little Gumby-ish to me. So
that made me wonder if it was going to be more of almost like a tactical game where you're positioning your team.
right.
You're doing some type of like pointing and mapping them, and they're moving into that spot. Because we didn't really get a whole lot of gameplay, so it's not sure how it's going to play. But I almost wonder, given the kind of reality of VR, that if that plays better in that environment versus a full-on military shooter.
And it might. Some other attractions like Star Child came on, and I'm like, why are you taking time during the press conference to show me, oh, you've got all this power of technology, you're in VR, and I'm looking at a 2D side-scrolling game. I'm like, I didn't understand that. Looked beautiful, but still, it's a 2D side-scrolling game. And then, so we had the Bravo team, and I noted the thing about the animation, but there was something else in here. The Inpatient. So looks very compelling. I'm sure it's going to be a very highly immersive game. And then I wrote, it looks like Outlast. Forget that. I'm not playing that in VR. I still have anxiety from having played the entirety of Outlast when it came out. I'm not playing that game in VR. So, and again, it had no release date. So no. So I walked away with it with nothing. I started to kind of inch towards that as they went through the trailers, but by the time I spooled out the end of it, I was like, nah, there's no need for me to do that. So yeah, and at a certain point in the press conference, what I was seeing was actually making me think more about going ahead and buying an Xbox One X, because I just didn't feel like there were good games there, but they're in content buckets that I tend to not dip into, and a lot of it was kind of oh well kind of stuff for me, like maybe on a Friday night when I have a Jones for something new to play, maybe I'll waltz into the PlayStation store and buy something on a whim, but I don't know that I saw anything that I firmly put on my, particularly when we talk, because we have this conversation about holiday buying list, right? I didn't feel anything that's taken up a slot on my holiday buying list other than Destiny 2 and Call of Duty 2, but I have lots of options on where to play that.
Yeah, that is very true. I think the only thing that was on my playlist or buy list for the fall that I was anticipating from this list was Spider-Man. Being a huge Spider-Man fan, even playing through the entirety of the Spider-Man the movie video game the past couple of years ago, which is not a great game, but I'm a sucker for Spider-Man and swinging around. That was the one game that I was planning on buying. It was one of the few games that pushed me over the top last year to pick up a PS4. That there was a critical mass of games either out or coming out. And that was as I sat with my 12-year-old son. He thought it looked amazing. He thought it looked super fun. He was also interested in kind of the story aspect of Detroit. And how that plays, I think would be interesting. It almost feels like there was a piece there, because last year the Detroit was almost more like an Android detective mystery, is how it played out.
Right.
And now it almost seems like, whether it's how the trailer was cut or if they've kind of refocused it, but it seems like kind of a social commentary, maybe even a little bit on kind of some of the Black Lives Matter, and there's some, us versus them protest piece that was highlighted there. So trying to see, to be a little more social relevant. How that comes out, how tone deaf or well done that is, would be interesting. But yeah, in terms of anything to pick up this fall that is Sony exclusive, I will say Lost Legacy looks great. It'll look great if we pick it up this fall or if you pick it up in a year from now, because it's going to play pretty solid. If I think about other things that are coming out, my son is interested in Crash, and I think co-op Knack as a family game could be really neat. But again, it could also be on sale by Christmas time. So there really wasn't anything here to get me excited. And this is where it goes back to my comment originally about almost coming off too confident, is that we've sold 50 million platforms. We've got a dominant lead in the marketplace. Here's what we have. You already own us, so we're not too worried about trying to convince you to buy us.
Right. So I'll come back around on my comment on that. So a couple other things that I want to mention about the games, but so Detroit, what was it again? Detroit
Becoming Human or Become Human
looked awesome. Very evocative and emotional from the way they played the trailer / demo. But again, I will mention in like 90% of the games, I think what I wrote down was, looks like Infamous plays like Deus Ex. And so there's going to be a lot of that going on. But Detroit Becoming, and it's unfortunate because it looks like Detroit Becoming Human is going to be a significant game in terms of story. I am not sure that that's a game that you put out right now. If that game is good, actually, there's an argument that the worst thing that could happen to this game is that it's good and that it's popular and it gets noticed and politicians and social commentators pick up on what it's saying, in this massive fear of automation and the robots replacing us that persist in this country and are tightly coupled to notions of things like protectionism and what we want to do with the economy. I don't know that this game plays that well in this space if the end result is that the androids win. So it's a very interesting play. The most interesting game that I saw, I think, out of the whole stack was Days Gone. But I watch a lot of The Walking Dead. I don't know that I need to play it, and tactically, market space wise, I don't understand right now how you do that game in the same space that you're releasing The Last of Us 2, which there was nothing shown at the press conference about, right? Which probably a good idea.
Yeah, it makes sense because they do kind of step on each other.
Right.
So
yeah. So
yeah. I'm a big fan of Sony, Ben. I've been a big fan since the Siphon Filter days. I think technically this game looks amazing. The gameplay should be really good, but in terms of concept and setting, there's just not a lot there to interest me, right? I think that because of the zombie genre is where it is right now, the zombie genre has moved more into kind of the survival genre more than the action genre. So let's any final thoughts on Sony, and we're gonna kind of kick it in to Nintendo for the last 15 minutes or so.
No, I'm good. Yeah, let's go ahead and cover Nintendo.
Okay, so this morning was Nintendo's, or noontime, depending on where you were, was Nintendo's Digital Spotlight. A handful of announcements. Again, this was only a 25-minute pre-recorded piece. And then from the show floor, they've had a couple other things as well. So I'm going to run through them all for the sake of brevity and time, and we can come back to them as you see fit. So there was a little bit of kind of a highly produced teaser in the beginning it was all focused on competition and people bringing their Switch into a variety of places. You had games of Splatoon 2 and ARMS and the reveal of Rocket League for Switch. And so you had that kind of there, and then the big game that kicked off the Microsoft, or I am getting all my press conferences combined together. The big thing that kicked off the Nintendo piece was Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And they had a big piece there. They had a big performance of it. They showed gameplay. They actually had, it wasn't just a slickly produced pre-rendered pieces. They had in-engine things. And the biggest surprise for me was that it's coming this fall. This is Monolith Soft, and they've been delayed on other things. So you have Sony kind of burying their big Japanese JRPG with Ni no Kuni in the pre-show, which neither one of us caught right away, and Nintendo leads off with it. And then they've also teased they teased a new 2D or side-scrolling Kirby game. They teased a Yoshi game that kind of goes between the foreground and background. Again, both coming in 2018. Then they had a little bit on, they had somebody from Game Freak and the Pokemon Company, and they just simply said that they are working on a mainline Pokemon game for Switch. No art, no concept, no nothing, but basically what people were looking for in last week's Nintendo Direct, Pokemon focused, they've addressed it here. When that comes, we'll see. Then we got another teaser for Metroid Prime 4, which was simply just the Metroid symbol and 4 and the name eventually. So no gameplay, no anything there. What we do know is that it's not Retro Studio making it. Then we spent a lot of time on some Nintendo or the Zelda DLC and some other Nintendo amiibos that are coming there. We got Fire Emblem Warriors, right? This is the Dynasty Warriors type of game, similar to Hyrule Warriors. Not any gameplay again, just a lot of cutscenes. And then we launched into Super Mario. Well, we went back and got what else did we? We went back and got a little bit more Rocket League. But then the last piece was kind of a big trailer on Super Mario Odyssey. And it wasn't until the end of the 25 minutes when they went to the show floor is where they started to show gameplay of these things. And on the show floor, they got Mario Odyssey. And then they also announced Metroid 2 remake for the 3DS, or kind of reimagining, and Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga remake, which was a GBA game for the 3DS. So they only showed Switch stuff during the presentation, which makes sense. It was kind of their big focus, and that's the system they want to be pushing and selling. But it's interesting that they're continuing to, whether they're just clearing the channel of 3DS games that have been in development, or that these are things that have started up at some point in time.
Are they showing Skyrim for Switch on the show floor?
So they talked about it when Numa was on during the piece. He talked about it that that Bethesda showed that there is the Skyrim for Switch with Nintendo or with Zelda Link skins and weapons and things like that, but they did not show anything of it because Bethesda showed some gameplay of it during their showcase on Sunday night.
Okay, gotcha. I had heard that there had been footage of it, but I wasn't sure exactly where it was shown.
Yeah, it was on Sunday night with the Bethesda piece. It has all the DLC that came with the original Skyrim. It's not being labeled as a remaster, so it's not quite at the graphical standards of the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 re-releases that Prime picked up so dutifully last year. But it looks a step above the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, so it's somewhere in the middle there, which makes sense given kind of where the graphics power are of the Switch. So as an owner, you and I are the owners of Switches. Is there anything on that list that makes you glad that you picked up your system when you did at the launch?
Rocket League is very interesting. That feels like a kind of payoff for taking the risk and putting down a pre-order. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, very interesting. The Switch might be a platform where I kind of explore some genres that I typically stay away from. So there might be some Kirby and Yoshi in there. I'm probably definitely going to get some Super Mario, so it's good that some additional footage was shown of that. Metroid Prime 4 will be interesting. I wound up kind of hating it on the Wii with the motion controls. So I'm looking very forward to the opportunity to play it with kind of standardized controls, and finally making my step into that franchise. Fire Emblem Warriors is very interested in. If I'm not completely certain or I don't have a firm grasp and understanding if the Fire Emblem gameplay is the same as that franchise continues. No, it changes. So
No, so this is going to be kind of Dynasty Warriors,
okay.
hack and slash type of, you're fighting off hundreds of waves of enemies type of thing.
Well, I enjoy one of those games like every 8 years or so. So
yeah, right. I mean, they're also nice on a. This is where I think you're right. This is where the portability of the Switch, whether it's for something like a huge JRPG game, which I would much rather play on the Switch versus in front of a console,
right.
Or playing 20 minutes of a hack and slash game like Fire Emblem Warriors is certainly more palatable than trying to sit down and play an hour of it and mashing buttons along the way.
So we're going to talk about this a little more on Thursday, I guess, where we maybe go back and talk about some of the publisher press conferences that have not been part of our core E3 coverage. But did EA show any Switch games during its press conference?
Yes, they talked about the FIFA,
cool.
And then actually it's not on the list here, but Nintendo did talk about it as well. And on Nintendo's, it's FIFA 18. Okay. So that was the big question, of that it was just FIFA Switch and maybe not quite the same. Okay. Obviously, it may not have all the same bells and whistles, but they are at least labeling it the same year structure. So yeah, they had a nice little piece on FIFA. They had a number of different gameplay pieces, and again, the kind of produced pieces of people playing their Switches under bridges and under overpasses and under things like that.
Did it have a release date?
This fall, yes.
Okay, all right, cool.
Yep, so, and I think that was released before by EA as well.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, we've got a few more things to go over on Thursday night, but in general, and maybe this is a bit of a telegraph of what I'll be talking about Thursday. At least, Nintendo to me didn't really need to do a lot. The Switch is there, the platform's available. As long as we continue to see a steady trickle of games coming to it, then it's headed in the right direction. And I'll make an admission because I'm sure it sounds like I was very negative about the Sony conference, but the reality is that you got 67% market share, 75% market share. And for whatever I said about last year's press conference, because I was definitely running, my opinion was counter to the vast majority of commentary that went around about how great a press conference it was. I feel like this year's press conference was worse. But when I look at my game metrics, I've spent the majority of my time in 2017 playing on my PlayStation 4. So there you go. So the rest of 2017 will be interesting because yes, I play a lot of my PS4, but I in general don't care that much for the third-person action game. So now when it looks like that's basically all they have coming out in the fall, that might kind of change that dynamic a bit. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, no, I think in terms of Sony, I was hoping to be more surprised than I was, and I think, but what they showed, everything looked really good. But yeah, I think they played it very safe, and they could. Microsoft needed to take some chances, but at the same time, I don't feel like I was really blown away by a lot that they showed. And I know you were pretty high on it at least a couple nights ago when we talked about it, and I think it was shown well, but for me personally, it doesn't necessarily move a needle a whole lot.
Yeah, and I think that'll be the thing to run through Thursday, right, is how do we differentiate between those? Because, like you mentioned, I think Phil Spencer clearly did a better job than Sean Layden, but Microsoft, the company, kind of left a cavernous hole for Sony to drive its Mac truck, the PS4, through with that $250 price differential between an Xbox One S and an Xbox One X. There's a ton of space there for Sony to be super competitive, right? So yeah, I guess we'll be doing that roundup conversation on Thursday.
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll say about Nintendo is, I think that the big piece for me of what they needed to do, or what I hope that they would do, is not delay games, right? That they had talked about Mario coming out this fall, and they committed to it. It's coming out this fall. They had said Xenoblade Chronicles was going to come out, and it is going to come out, right? I think that's the big piece in terms of a Switch owner, or to give people, as they're continue to hard to find, that there's still at least a trickle of games coming out that make it worth, staying around for. So that brings us to we got it under an hour here, kind of late at night here, so thank you for sticking with us. Zeus, any final thoughts on this evening before we head it out and be back again on Thursday night?
One more telegraph for Thursday, because it just occurred to me. One key difference between the Microsoft and Nintendo conferences is both of those companies were coming in hot on new hardware, right? Sony was the only company that's software only, games only this year. Not to say that's a bad thing. Lots of people think that the hardware shouldn't matter, but the reality is that it does, right? So that's going to make the remainder of 2017 look very interesting. I don't know that it's the slam dunk that some people might think it is, but I will also admit that I need to ruminate on that a little more myself.
Yeah, well, and as you out there have listened to this, if you've seen some of the broadcast, the podcast, the production from the show floor on a variety of things, read some gameplay, seen trailers and gameplay, ask us questions, post in the comments, be prepared to come back again here on Thursday night as we wrap up E3 and give some kind of top takeaways for us. But also, if you have comments, if you have thoughts, always feel free to let us know, whether it's here on YouTube or over on Gearworks as well. So for Zeus Adamus and DBQ Hams, thank you again for joining us, and we will see you at the end of E3 on Thursday night.